sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest transformations. What happens when someone who believes the world revolves around them meets someone whose entire existence is built on duty, honor, and silent sacrifice? In the heart of London, where millions of tourists snap photos and rush past without a second thought, stands a figure so still he seems carved from stone. But behind that red uniform and stoic expression lies a human being with feelings, dreams, and a story that would humble anyone who took the time to listen. This is the story of Karen Mitchell, a woman who thought she knew everything about respect until she learned what it truly means from the most unexpected teacher. It's about the moment when entitlement meets humility, when ignorance faces wisdom, and when a single act of cruelty becomes the catalyst for the most important lesson of someone's life. What you're about to read isn't just a story about a tourist and a guard. It's about all of us, and how quickly our perspective can change when we finally see beyond ourselves. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some teachers appear in the most unlikely places. The question isn't whether Karen deserved what happened to her that day. The question is, what would you have done in her place? And more importantly, what will you do differently after hearing her story? Karen Mitchell had always believed that money could buy anything, including respect. At 43, she had built her life around this principle, accumulating wealth through her successful marketing consultancy, while treating those she considered beneath her with casual indifference. Her expensive handbag, designer clothes, and perfectly manicured nails were like armor, protecting her from having to acknowledge that other people might have feelings worth considering. The London vacation was supposed to be her reward for closing a major deal. She had planned every detail meticulously, from the five-star hotel overlooking Hyde Park to the exclusive restaurants where she would dine alone, photographing her meals for social media. Karen's followers knew her as someone who lived life to the fullest, though they couldn't see the loneliness that drove her constant need to prove her success to the world. On that particular Tuesday morning, the October air carried a crispness that made tourists move a little faster through the streets. Karen had already visited 3 major attractions, checking them off her list with the efficiency of someone who valued experiences more for their Instagram potential than their actual meaning. Buckingham Palace was next on her agenda, and she approached it with the same entitled confidence that had carried her through life. The crowds were thicker than usual, filled with families on half-term holidays and elderly couples moving slowly with their walking sticks. Karen pushed through them without apology, her heels clicking authoritatively on the pavement. She had paid good money for this trip, and she wasn't going to let anyone slow her down. When she reached the palace gates, her attention was immediately drawn to the royal guard standing at his post. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with the kind of rigid posture that spoke of months of training and discipline. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, and his face set in the neutral expression that had become iconic around the world. But Karen didn't see any of that. What she saw was an obstacle to the perfect photograph she wanted to take. She had already taken dozens of selfies, but none captured the grandeur she felt she deserved to be associated with. The guard was positioned exactly where she wanted to stand for her shot, and his presence in the background would make her photo look more authentic, more impressive. All she needed was for him to move slightly to the left. "Excuse me," she said loudly, stepping closer to the guard. "Could you move over a bit? You're blocking my shot." The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. This wasn't unusual. Tourists made requests like this dozens of times each day, and guards were trained to maintain their position regardless of public interaction. Karen waited a moment, expecting immediate compliance. When it didn't come, her irritation began to build. She was used to people accommodating her wishes, especially service workers and public employees. In her mind, this guard was essentially a living decoration, there for her entertainment and convenience. "Hello?" she said more sharply, waving her hand in front of his face. "I'm talking to you. Just move a little to the left. It'll only take a second." Several other tourists began to notice the interaction, some stopping to watch what was unfolding. A few were already reaching for their phones, recognizing that they might be witnessing something worth recording. But Karen was too focused on her frustration to notice the growing audience. The guard's training was extensive and clear. He was not to move from his position except under specific circumstances. He was not to respond to casual tourist interactions. He was not to break character or acknowledge requests that fell outside his duties. His job was to stand guard, not to serve as a prop for vacation photos. But Karen had never learned to accept the word no, especially not from someone she perceived as being in a service role. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "I'm a paying tourist." The least you could do is help me get a decent picture." She looked around at the other visitors, expecting to find sympathy or support. Instead, she saw a mixture of amusement and second-hand embarrassment. An elderly British couple exchanged glances and shook their heads. A family with young children gathered their kids closer, not wanting them to witness what was clearly becoming an unpleasant scene. Karen's frustration reached a boiling point. In her world, problems were solved by escalating demands until someone in authority intervened on her behalf. She was accustomed to asking for managers, making complaints, and generally throwing her weight around until she got what she wanted. She had finished a coffee and pastry from an expensive cafe about an hour earlier, and the empty cup and wrapper were still in her hand. She had been looking for a trash bin but had been too focused on her photography agenda to bother finding one. Now, in her anger and entitlement, those pieces of garbage became weapons. "Fine," she said loudly, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "If you're going to be rude and ignore me, then maybe this will get your attention." Without warning, she threw the empty coffee cup directly at the guard's chest. It bounced off his red tunic and clattered to the ground, followed immediately by the crumpled pastry wrapper that she flung at his face. The wrapper hit the brim of his bearskin hat and fluttered down to his feet. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The crowd that had been casually watching suddenly fell silent. Phones were raised, cameras started recording, and the atmosphere shifted from mild curiosity to genuine shock. Even in a city accustomed to tourist behavior ranging from merely rude to actively obnoxious, Karen had crossed a line that most people recognized instinctively. The guard remained perfectly still, but Karen could see something change in his eyes. It wasn't anger or surprise. It was something deeper and more complex. For just a moment, she caught a glimpse of the human being behind the uniform, and what she saw there should have given her pause. But Karen was too caught up in her own righteousness to recognize the gravity of what she had done. In her mind, she had finally gotten a reaction, even if it wasn't the one she wanted. She felt justified in her actions, convinced that the guard's rudeness had forced her hand. "Maybe now you'll learn some customer service," she said smugly, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just assaulted a member of the British military while dozens of witnesses recorded her every word in action. What Karen didn't know was that royal guards are not tourist attractions or customer service representatives. They are highly trained soldiers, often with combat experience, who take their duty to protect the monarchy and the palace with deadly seriousness. What she had just done wasn't just rude. It was a criminal offense that could result in arrest and prosecution. More importantly, what she didn't know was who this particular guard was and what he had been through to earn the right to wear that uniform. She didn't know about the sacrifices he had made, the training he had endured, or the profound sense of honor that made him stand motionless in the face of her assault. As the crowd continued to grow and phones continued to record, Karen finally began to sense that something was wrong. The looks she was receiving weren't admiring or sympathetic. They were judgmental, disappointed, and in some cases, openly hostile. A security officer was already making his way through the crowd, having been alerted by the commotion. Other guards were taking notice without breaking their own positions. Tourism police who patrolled the area were being summoned by concerned witnesses. But the most significant reaction was yet to come. Among the crowd that had gathered was someone who knew exactly who the guard was and what his story meant. Someone who would ensure that Karen's actions had consequences she never could have imagined. Someone who would teach her the most important lesson of her life. The security officer who approached Karen was not what she expected. Instead of the young, easily intimidated authority figure she was prepared to charm or browbeat into submission, she found herself facing a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world to be impressed by her designer outfit. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of experience in handling difficult situations. Karen's first instinct was to argue. "I don't think so. I haven't done anything wrong. That guard was being rude and unprofessional, and I was just trying to get his attention." The officer, whose name tag read Inspector Morrison, looked at her with something approaching disbelief. "Ma'am, you just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Guard in full view of dozens of witnesses. Several people have already uploaded video footage to social media. This is not a misunderstanding." The word assault hit Karen like a physical blow. In her world, assault was something that happened in dark alleys or domestic disputes. It wasn't something that successful businesswomen did to public employees who were being uncooperative. "That's completely ridiculous," she protested, her voice rising. I threw an empty cup at him. "It's littering at worst. You can't seriously be calling that assault." Inspector Morrison gestured toward the guard who remained at his post despite the debris at his feet and the continued attention of the crowd. That man is a serving member of the British Army. He's not a tourist attraction or a customer service representative. He's a soldier doing his job, and what you did constitutes assault on a member of the armed forces. For the first time since the incident began, Karen felt a flutter of genuine concern. She had traveled enough to know that legal systems in foreign countries could be unpredictable, and the last thing she needed was an international incident that could affect her business or her ability to travel. "Look," she said, adopting the reasonable tone she used with difficult clients, "I think we're making too big a deal of this. I'm a successful businesswoman from America. I'm not some kind of criminal. I was just frustrated because he wouldn't help me with a simple request." Inspector Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that her words were having the opposite effect of what she intended. "Come with me, please. There are some things you need to understand." Reluctantly, Karen allowed herself to be led away from the crowd toward a small office building adjacent to the palace grounds. As they walked, she could hear the murmur of conversation behind them and knew that people were still recording, still talking about what they had witnessed. The office they entered was simple and utilitarian, with basic furniture and walls lined with photographs and commendations. Inspector Morrison gestured for her to sit in a hard plastic chair while he took his place behind a desk covered with paperwork and official documents. "Before we discuss the legal implications of what you've done," he began, "I want to tell you something about the man you just assaulted." Karen opened her mouth to protest the word "assaulted" again, but something in his tone made her close it without speaking. "That guard's name is Private James Richardson. He's 22 years old, and he's been with the Grenadier Guards for 3 years. Before he was stationed here at the palace, he served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan." The inspector paused, watching Karen's face for any sign that this information was having an impact. She was listening, but her expression suggested that she was still more concerned with her own situation than with learning about the guard. During his second tour, Private Richardson's unit was conducting a routine patrol in Helmand Province when their convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device. 3 soldiers were killed instantly. 2 others were critically wounded. Inspector Morrison reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a folder, opening it to reveal several photographs and official documents. Private Richardson was one of the wounded. He spent 4 months in military hospitals undergoing 7 surgeries to save his left leg. The doctors weren't sure he would walk normally again, let alone be able to serve. Karen found herself looking at the photographs despite her discomfort. They showed a young man in a hospital bed, his face pale and drawn, his leg encased in a complex framework of metal pins and supports. Even in her self-centered state, she could see the pain and determination in his eyes.
"He fought for 18 months to regain full mobility,"
the inspector continued. "Physical therapy, psychological counseling, determination that most people couldn't imagine. All because he wanted to continue serving his country." The inspector turned one of the photographs toward her. It showed the same young man in dress uniform, standing proudly with his family on the day he was cleared for active duty. When he was finally deemed fit for service, he specifically requested assignment to ceremonial duties. Do you know why? Karen shook her head, finding it difficult to maintain eye contact with the image. Because he wanted to honor the memory of the soldiers who died in that convoy. He wanted to represent the best of what the British military stands for. Every day he puts on that uniform and stands at that post, he's not just doing a job, he's fulfilling a promise he made to his fallen comrades. The inspector closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. Private Richardson has never missed a day of duty since returning to active service. He's never broken character or failed to maintain his post, regardless of weather, crowds, or the behavior of tourists. He takes his responsibility to honor both his country and his fallen friends with absolute seriousness. Karen was beginning to feel something she rarely experienced, genuine shame. But her defensive mechanisms were still operating, trying to find a way to minimize her culpability. "I didn't know any of that," she said quietly. "How was I supposed to know? He's just standing there." There's no sign explaining his background. Inspector Morrison nodded slowly. "You're right. There's no sign. But that's exactly the point, isn't it? You assumed that because you didn't know his story, he didn't have one. You assumed that because he was in a service role, he was there to serve you personally." The words stung because they were undeniably true. Karen had made exactly those assumptions. Just as she had made similar assumptions about countless other people throughout her life. "The thing is, Miss Mitchell," the inspector continued, having somehow learned her name during the brief time they had been talking, "Private Richardson's story isn't unique. Every person you encounter has a story. Every person in a uniform, behind a counter, or in any role that you might consider service has experiences, challenges, and dignity that you know nothing about. Karen was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had learned. The weight of her actions was beginning to settle on her, but there was still a part of her that resisted taking full responsibility. "I understand that he's been through terrible things," she said finally, "and I'm sorry for what happened to him, but that doesn't change the fact that I was just asking for a simple favor. A little flexibility wouldn't have hurt anyone." Inspector Morrison's expression hardened slightly. "Ms. Mitchell, let me explain something about military protocol. Guards like Private Richardson are not stationed there to accommodate tourist requests. They're there to protect the monarchy and maintain security. Breaking position or responding to civilian requests would be a dereliction of duty that could result in court-martial." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "But more than that, the discipline required to maintain that position, especially for someone who has been through what Private Richardson has experienced, is part of his healing process. Standing guard gives him purpose, structure, and a way to honor his service and his fallen comrades." The inspector stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the palace where Private Richardson continued his duty despite the earlier incident. "When you threw garbage at him and demanded that he break protocol for your convenience, you weren't just being rude to a tourist attraction. You were attacking the very thing that gives his life meaning after surviving trauma that would break most people." Karen felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, though she couldn't tell if they were tears of shame, self-pity, or genuine remorse. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just frustrated." "I believe that you didn't intend to cause genuine harm," Inspector Morrison said, returning to his seat. "But intent isn't the only thing that matters. Impact matters too. And the impact of your actions goes far beyond the few minutes it took you to throw trash at a soldier." He pulled out his phone and showed her a screen displaying social media posts. "The video of your behavior has already been viewed thousands of times. People are sharing it, commenting on it, using it as an example of entitled American tourist behavior. Private Richardson, who has served his country with honor and distinction, is now the subject of international attention because someone thought he wasn't being accommodating enough." Karen stared at the phone screen, seeing her own face captured in unflattering moments of anger and entitlement. The comments below the videos were brutal, calling her everything from ugly American to much worse. But more troubling were the comments defending the guard and sharing information about military service and sacrifice. "This is going to ruin my business," she whispered, the full implications of the situation finally beginning to dawn on her. Inspector Morrison set his phone aside. "Your business concerns are not my priority, Ms. Mitchell. My concern is with the legal implications of what you've done and with the impact on the soldier you attacked." He opened another folder and pulled out several official documents. Assault on a member of the armed forces is a serious charge. You could face fines, imprisonment, and a permanent ban from entering the United Kingdom. The Crown Prosecution Service takes these matters very seriously. Karen's face went pale. Prison? For throwing an empty cup? For assaulting a soldier while he was performing his duties? The inspector corrected firmly. The method of assault is less important than the fact that it occurred and the circumstances surrounding it. The room fell quiet, except for the sound of voices outside and the distant traffic of London. Karen found herself thinking about her life, her business, and the comfortable bubble of privilege that had insulated her from ever having to face real consequences for her behavior. For the first time in years, she was forced to confront the possibility that her actions might have repercussions she couldn't buy, charm, or argue her way out of. And for the first time since the incident began, she started to think about someone other than herself. She thought about Private Richardson, standing at his post with her garbage at his feet, maintaining his dignity and his duty despite being publicly humiliated by someone who knew nothing about his sacrifice or his strength. Inspector Morrison gave Karen several minutes to absorb the gravity of her situation before speaking again. When he did, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming less accusatory and more instructional. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been working palace security for 15 years. I've seen every type of tourist behavior imaginable, from the merely inconsiderate to the truly outrageous. Most incidents are handled with warnings or simple ejection from the grounds. Your case is different." Karen looked up from her hands, which she had been studying while trying to process everything she had learned about Private Richardson. "Different how?" "Because of who witnessed it, and because of what they've decided to do about it," the inspector replied, reaching for his phone again. "Among the crowd that watched your interaction with Private Richardson was Colonel Sarah Henley, retired. She served in Afghanistan during the same period as Private Richardson, though in a different unit. He showed Karen a photograph on his phone of a distinguished woman in her 40s wearing civilian clothes, but carrying herself with unmistakable military bearing. Colonel Henley has taken a personal interest in your case. She's the one who provided me with Private Richardson's background information, and she's the one who's been in contact with his family and former unit members. Karen felt a new wave of dread washing over her. What does that mean for me? It means that this isn't going to be handled quietly or dismissed easily, Inspector Morrison explained. Colonel Henley has substantial influence in military circles, and she's deeply committed to ensuring that service members are treated with the respect they've earned. She's already been in contact with military advocacy groups and veteran support organizations. The inspector set his phone aside and fixed Karen with a steady gaze. However, she's also a practical person who believes in the power of education over pure punishment. She's proposed an alternative to formal charges if you're willing to accept it. Karen straightened in her chair, grasping at this unexpected lifeline. What kind of alternative? Colonel Henley has suggested that instead of pursuing criminal charges, you be required to complete a program of military education and community service. The goal would be to help you understand not just what you did wrong, but why it was wrong and how you can do better. The inspector pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk between them. The program would last 6 months and would involve several components. First, you would spend time at veteran rehabilitation centers, both here in the UK and when you return to America. You would listen to stories from service members who have been wounded in action and learn about their recovery processes. Karen opened the folder and found detailed descriptions of various programs and facilities. The scope of what was being proposed was far more extensive than she had expected. Second, Inspector Morrison continued, you would be required to research and write detailed reports about military service, sacrifice, and the challenges faced by returning veterans. These reports would be reviewed by Colonel Henley and used in educational programs for other tourists and civilians. He turned to another section of the folder. Third, you would perform community service specifically focused on supporting military families and veteran organizations. This might include fundraising, administrative work, or direct assistance with family support programs. Karen studied the documents, trying to understand the full implications of what was being offered. And if I complete all of this, the charges would be dropped? If you complete the program satisfactorily and demonstrate genuine understanding and change behavior, yes, the formal charges would not be pursued, Inspector Morrison confirmed. However, Colonel Henley has been very clear about one additional requirement. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. You would be required to make a formal, public apology to Private Richardson. Not just a quick sorry and move on, but a comprehensive acknowledgement of what you did, why it was wrong, and what you've learned from the experience. The idea of a public apology made Karen's stomach churn. Her entire professional identity was built around projecting confidence and authority. Admitting fault publicly, especially on something that had already gone viral on social media, would be professionally and personally humiliating. I understand this is difficult, the inspector said, seeming to read her thoughts. But Colonel Henley's point is that Private Richardson was publicly humiliated through no fault of his own. The least you can do is accept some public responsibility for your actions. Karen was quiet for a long time, weighing her options. The alternative to accepting the program was facing criminal charges in a foreign country, with all the legal costs, potential jail time, and permanent consequences that would entail. But accepting the program meant acknowledging that her entire approach to interacting with other people had been fundamentally wrong. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Why is Colonel Henley offering this alternative? Why not just let me face the consequences of what I did? Inspector Morrison smiled for the first time since their conversation began. Because she believes that people can change, and that creating understanding is more valuable than simply punishing ignorance. She's seen what happens when civilians and military members don't understand each other. The goal isn't to destroy your life, Miss Mitchell. It's to help you become someone who would never do something like this again. He gestured toward the window in the direction of the palace grounds. Private Richardson, when Colonel Henley spoke with him after his shift, expressed similar sentiments. He said he doesn't want you to be prosecuted if you're genuinely willing to learn from this experience. Karen felt a fresh wave of shame, this time mixed with something approaching gratitude. The man she had assaulted was advocating for leniency on her behalf. The magnanimity of that gesture was almost harder to bear than anger would have been. There's one more thing, Inspector Morrison added. Colonel Henley wants to meet with you before you make your final decision. She feels it's important that you understand exactly what this program will require and that you're making an informed choice. 30 minutes later, Karen found herself in a small cafe near the palace, sitting across from Colonel Sarah Henley. The retired officer was smaller than Karen had expected, but she radiated the kind of quiet authority that made her presence immediately commanding. "Miss Mitchell," Colonel Henley began, "I want to start by saying that I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who has never been forced to consider perspectives outside your own experience." Karen nodded, not trusting herself to speak without saying something that might make the situation worse. "The program Inspector Morrison described isn't designed to punish you," the colonel continued. "It's designed to expand your understanding of service, sacrifice, and respect. But I want to be very clear about something. It will be challenging, and it will require you to confront some uncomfortable truths about how you've been living your life." Colonel Henley ordered tea for both of them before continuing. "I served with many soldiers like Private Richardson. They're people who have seen the worst that humans can do to each other, and yet they continue to serve, to protect, and to maintain dignity, even when others don't extend the same courtesy to them." She fixed Karen with a steady gaze. "The question I have for you is this. Are you genuinely willing to learn, or are you just looking for a way to avoid consequences? Because if it's the latter, we're wasting everyone's time." Karen considered the question carefully. Her first instinct was to say whatever would get her out of trouble, but something about Colonel Henley's directness demanded honesty. "I don't know," she said finally. "I mean, I want to avoid going to jail, obviously, but sitting here, learning about Private Richardson's story, I keep thinking about how I would feel if someone treated me the way I treated him, and I realize I've probably made other people feel that way before." Colonel Henley nodded approvingly. "That's a start. Self-awareness is the beginning of change, but it's only the beginning. The real work comes in changing behavior patterns that have been developing for decades." Over the next hour, Colonel Henley outlined exactly what the program would entail. She explained the veteran centers Karen would visit, the people she would meet, and the stories she would hear. She described the research projects and community service requirements in detail. "The most important part," the colonel said, "will be learning to see people as individuals with their own stories, rather than as obstacles or service providers for your convenience. That's a fundamental shift in perspective that affects every interaction you have." As their conversation continued, Karen found herself thinking about her life in ways she never had before. She thought about the hotel staff she barely acknowledged, the restaurant servers she treated as invisible, the airline employees she complained to when flights were delayed. She began to realize that her behavior toward Private Richardson wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern that had defined her interactions with people for years. "I want to do the program," she said finally, "not just because I want to avoid charges, but because I think I need to understand things I've never bothered to learn." Colonel Henley smiled. "Good. But understand that accepting this program means accepting responsibility, not just for what you did today, but for examining all the ways you interact with other people. It means being willing to be uncomfortable and to admit that you've been wrong about things you've taken for granted." Karen nodded. "I understand. The program begins immediately," Colonel Henley continued. "Your first visit will be to a rehabilitation center here in London tomorrow morning. You'll spend the day with veterans who are recovering from combat injuries, listening to their stories and learning about their challenges." She handed Karen a card with contact information and schedules. "Inspector Morrison will coordinate with your embassy to ensure your visa status allows for the extended stay required by the program. This is not something you can complete quickly or superficially." As they prepared to leave the cafe, Colonel Henley placed a hand on Karen's shoulder. "Miss Mitchell, Private Richardson is an exceptional young man who has already forgiven you for what you did today. The question now is whether you can learn enough from this experience to become worthy of that forgiveness." 6 months later, Karen stood once again in front of Buckingham Palace, but this time she wasn't there as a tourist seeking the perfect selfie. She was there to fulfill the final requirement of her program, a public apology to Private Richardson. The months between had transformed her in ways she never could have anticipated. She had spent weeks in veteran rehabilitation centers, listening to stories of courage, sacrifice, and resilience that humbled her completely. She had researched and written extensively about military service, learning about the challenges faced by service members and their families. She had worked with veteran support organizations, helping to coordinate fundraising events and family assistance programs. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to see people differently. Every interaction, from hotel housekeeping staff to restaurant servers to airline gate agents, had become an opportunity to practice treating others with dignity and respect. Private Richardson was at his post, as always, maintaining the same perfect stillness and discipline that had made him a target for her frustration months earlier. This time, Karen approached with reverence rather than entitlement. "Private Richardson," she said quietly, standing at a respectful distance. "My name is Karen Mitchell. 6 months ago, I assaulted you while you were performing your duties. I'm here to apologize." The crowd that had gathered was different this time. Instead of casual tourists, it included Colonel Henley, Inspector Morrison, representatives from veteran organizations, and media members who had been following Karen's story. "I want you to know that I've spent the last 6 months learning about military service, about sacrifice, and about the honor that comes with wearing the uniform you wear. I've met veterans who have given everything for their country, and I've learned about the challenges they face when they return home." Karen's voice was steady but emotional. "What I did to you was inexcusable.
I treated you as if you were there for my convenience, rather than understanding that you were performing a sacred duty.
I threw garbage at a man who had already sacrificed more for his country than I had ever sacrificed for anything."
She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "I've learned that respect isn't something you can demand or buy. It's something you earn by treating others with dignity, by recognizing their humanity, and by understanding that every person you encounter has a story worth honoring."
Private Richardson remained at attention, but Karen could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there during their first encounter.
It was recognition, acknowledgement, and perhaps even a measure of respect for the journey she had undertaken. "I can't undo what I did that day," Karen concluded, "but I can promise that I will never again treat another person the way I treated you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the forgiveness you've already given me." When she finished speaking, the crowd was silent. Even the usual noise of London traffic seemed muted. After a moment, Private Richardson did something unprecedented. He gave an almost imperceptible nod, a tiny acknowledgement that stayed within the bounds of his duties, while still conveying his acceptance of her apology. Colonel Henley approached Karen as the crowd began to disperse. "How do you feel?" Karen wiped tears from her eyes. "Grateful. Ashamed of who I was, but grateful for the chance to become someone better." "And what will you do now?" the colonel asked. "I'm going home," Karen said. "But first, I'm going to continue working with veteran organizations. I've learned too much to just go back to my old life and pretend this never happened." She looked back at Private Richardson, who had resumed his perfect stillness and discipline. "I've learned that some people stand guard over things that matter more than themselves.
And I've learned that the rest of us need to be worthy of their service."
As Karen walked away from Buckingham Palace for the last time, she carried with her not just the memory of her transformation, but a commitment to live differently.
The lesson she had learnt was indeed priceless, but the price of learning it had been the comfortable ignorance that had allowed her to treat others poorly for so many years. She had thrown trash at a royal guard, but in return, she had received something far more valuable, the chance to become a person who would never do such a thing again. And in a world where true change is rare and precious, that transformation was worth more than any selfie or social media post could ever be.